So, good evening. My name is Paul Vincel. I'm one of the co-founders of the Conduit, and it is delightful and entirely unsurprising to see an extremely full house to hear about Elif Shafak's most recent work. So, we were just talking before we got onto stage that the last time we had a conversation was during a pre-COVID podcast that we did together. And I do think that the world has changed a bit since then.
It has so much. It feels so depressing, doesn't it? Especially these days. But I'm so happy to be here. I think this is how we find our traces of hope and through these connections. So really very happy to be here.
We're absolutely thrilled to have you. And so I want to start with the kind of central metaphor of your book. Your book is a meditation about the politics of water, the life of a raindrop, and the interconnectedness between it and a range of protagonists. So what caused you to settle on that really fascinating original conceit?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I wondered if I could build an entire novel on a tiny drop of water, on something as small and seemingly as insignificant as a raindrop. And I did not want to take that raindrop for granted. Today, in many ways, when we talk about climate crisis, we are primarily talking about freshwater crisis. But I think it's so easy to forget that. It's so easy because, look at the rain, look at the flash floods, look at sea levels rising. So it feels like there's an abundance of water all around. But actually, the irony is we're living in a time of water scarcity. So there isn't enough fresh water. And for those of us coming from the Middle East, this is not some theoretical, abstract debate. It is an acute reality. So of the most 10 water-stressed nations in the world today, 7 are in the Middle East and in North Africa, which means our rivers are dying. And of course, this has consequences for everyone, but particularly for women, particularly for children and for minorities. Women are water carriers. When there's no water nearby, the distance that a young woman has to walk increases, unfortunately increasing the possibility for gender violence. So actually everything is so connected. We tend to think they're in separate boxes, like water scarcity, climate crisis, gender violence, racial inequality, but actually everything is connected. And I think in order to understand how connected we are with each other, but also with nature, we need to look perhaps no further than the journey of a single drop of water.
So at about midnight last night, when I was going over the book again and preparing for this conversation, I found myself saying, my God, Elif is turning me into like an amateur hydrologist. And I wanted to just check, because I think there's a conceit in this that is all the water that lives in the world has been there since the beginning of time. And it flows and is unevenly distributed, but it is present from that original ancient creationist drop through to today. And that
is so true.
Now it just needs to be just on.
I hope it's, yeah. And as you said, we haven't invented new sources of water. So actually, we tend to think that the water inside this glass, the tears that we might have shed just this morning, or the water that's present in the river Tigris, Euphrates, the Ganges, Mississippi, we tend to think they're separate bodies of water, but actually it's exactly the same water that we carry inside right this moment. So it just keeps circulating and circulating. And in so many ways, of course, water is still one of the biggest mysteries in our lives. It doesn't behave in the way we expect it to behave. I was quite surprised, actually, to learn that the number of scientists who study water is relatively small. You would expect more people to study water. So it's an endless mystery, and I became very intrigued by this concept of water memory. Maybe we will talk about that if we have time.
So you have 3 main protagonists, but you set it up with somebody who's maybe protagonist Zero, who's a particularly odious, unpleasant, murderous tyrant, Ashurbanipal. And tell us about this fellow.
Yeah, I'm so glad we start with him, because the book starts with him in a way. This tiny little drop of water falls on the head of this mighty and very cultured, very educated, the most educated king that the empire has ever seen. But that doesn't mean he's less cruel than his predecessors, right? But this is the person who changed the history of the world. He built the famous library of Ashurbanipal, in which we find thousands and thousands of clay tablets, cuneiform, which means he accumulates the knowledge within the empire and beyond, sometimes by force, sometimes deceit, but he brings all that knowledge into the library. Among those tablets is the oldest piece of literature known in human history, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. We need to bear in mind that before it was written down by scribes on tablets, it was transmitted orally, grandparents telling it to grandchildren. So actually the epic is much, much older than we assume. And the interesting thing is empires have a way of thinking that they are here forever. That's what the Assyrian Empire assumed. But it was razed down. And when everything was burned down, when Nineveh was destroyed, so was the library. But the interesting thing about clay tablets is, unlike papyrus, unlike paper, if you burn down a library full of clay tablets, what you do is you harden those tablets. So they remained quite strong under the ground, albeit in shattered form, until much, much later, French and archaeologists, British and French archaeologists came and dug them up, which brings us to another, I think, quite controversial story. Yeah.
So, dear audience, you are going to see three characters very improbably, but actually remarkably, credibly connected in this remarkable piece of work. So I'm going to invite you to take us to Arthur Smythe. It's the 1840s, so you've gone from Mesopotamia to Victorian London, an urchin, somebody who has hyperthymesis, the ability to discern and remember things with a vivid level of detail. And he re-encounters these tablets in a different setting. Tell us about that.
Yeah, thank you. The main three characters in this book, maybe I should have said at the beginning, it's the story of three characters who seem to be very different, but are connected in a surprising way. And then two rivers, the river Thames and the river Tigris, and one ancient poem, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's the 3, 2, 1. That's the structure. But those three characters are related to each other as though they were atoms in a water molecule, so like the H2O, right? At the start, or at the center, maybe I should say, there is Arthur that Paul kindly mentioned. I call him, he's my oxygen, I call him King Arthur of the sewers and the slums. There's a reason why he's given this unusual name. But if he had been born today, I think we would have respected the beauty of his mind, the neurodivergence of his brain, because this is someone who, even though he has been given no education whatsoever, born into very severe poverty, born in the slum tenements of Chelsea at the time in Victorian England, he has an incredible visual memory. And I loosely based him on an actual historical figure called George Smith. So this person existed, although we don't know much about his life. And it's very interesting, George Smith, purely by coincidence, he enters the British Museum, he sees these broken, shattered tablets from the time of Ashurbanipal and beyond, and little by little he pieces them together. And he discovers the Epic of Gilgamesh, not only the epic itself, but the flood tablet, which is at the same time a very divisive subject, because what he finds in the flood tablet is there's an ark, or Professor Finkel would say, correct me, he would say it's a coracle. So there's a coracle, inside there are animals, there are human beings, a deluge, surrounded by water, looking for land, flying birds to see if there's land around. And the story is very familiar, isn't it? So the interesting thing is the biblical story of the flood, that is what he encounters, except this one was written thousands and thousands of years before the Old Testament. So that divides the society. Those who are more inclined towards religion would say, well, you see, the holy books are right, it really happened. But those who are more scientific-minded would say, actually, as humanity, we have been repeating the same old stories again and again. And he finds himself at the center of that debate. If I may quickly add, today, the actual George Smith, because he came to the Middle East in order to find the missing lines in the flood tablet, he lost his life there. Today he's buried between Syria and Turkey in a graveyard that is almost forgotten.
So your next jump is to Narin, a Yazidi girl. And I think some of the most both horrifying and moving parts of this book are a description of the Yazidi people. And I think if you think about what's happening right now, today, in the Middle East, the Yazidis almost seem to be forgotten again, that their plight needs to be retold. And so I was so grateful that you reminded us of this uncured injustice. Tell us a little bit about her, and then tell us about the Lamassu and this winged eagle, bull, human figure, mythical creature, and their relationship and the role between them.
Yeah, I really appreciate this. Actually, this August, a few weeks back, it was the 10th anniversary of the Yazidi genocide, which ISIS launched in 2014. But of course, the Yazidi lore talks about 72 massacres, not just one. So it's a long history of persecution. It is one of the most misunderstood, mistreated, maligned, and attacked minorities in the history of the world. And it's also a challenge, I think, for a writer, because this is a community, beautiful community, very vulnerable community, in which memory is mostly transmitted via folk tales, ballads, songs, orally, but not written culture as much. Yeah, so you have to do a lot of listening, and that was a challenge for me. And I learned so much, and I had to do a lot of unlearning as well. But perhaps we haven't noticed that when ISIS launched their horrific attack, the very first thing they did, it was so calculated, it was so deliberate, the very first thing they did was to attack the water. So they killed the water first. They poisoned all the wells, all the fountains, all the sources of water. The second thing ISIS fanatics did was to kill the elderly. Now, if you kill the elderly in a community like the Yazidis, in which memory is transmitted or kept by the elderly, you're killing collective memory and you're killing collective identity. Then they killed the men and they kidnapped women and children. As we're speaking, still more than 3,000 Yazidi women are missing. While I was writing this book, one of them was found, saved from a house in Ankara, in the neighborhood where I grew up, where my maternal grandmother's house was, so just a few streets away. My point is, how is it possible that people who are treated as sexual slaves are kept across the Middle East, and somehow it becomes invisible, as in the neighborhood, we become numb. So it got me thinking, it struck me really hard, but all I'm trying to say is, in that regard, the Yazidi genocide is still not over.
I wonder if you can return to that for a moment. I mean, you're a student of history, you've written about abusive regimes, about the memory of genocides. Why is it that you think this particular genocide has been so elusive and so hard to pin down and so hard to name and describe and so hard to pursue justice for? What is it about it that makes it, this group of people, so unsympathetic as victims and so unremedied?
I think they're very lonely. They have been misunderstood throughout the flow of history. And as you read the book, you will see also British archaeologists at the time, they call them, quote unquote, devil worshippers. That was the nickname given to Yazidis. That was the mistreatment and misunderstanding. It has nothing to do, of course, with that. So there's a long history of persecution and misunderstanding. If I may add this, I really cannot get my head around the fact that this country has not accepted any women, any survivors of the Yazidi genocide, unlike Germany at the time. Germany did, and there's a community right now in Germany, and there's a lot of individual and collective healing that they are still trying to achieve. But we did not accept any of them, you know? So you tell me, I mean, they're very, very lonely in many ways.
Okay, so we now fast forward from roughly 2014, if memory serves, to 2018 to Zaleekhah Clark, who's a hydrologist living in a houseboat in Chelsea. Tell us about this third leg of the stool in your story.
Of course, Chelsea in that time has changed so much and has become the Chelsea that we know today. The character that Paul is mentioning, Zaleekhah, she's the children of immigrants. She's going through a rough time in her life. As the story begins, she's going through a divorce, but she's also, I think, going through an existential crisis in which she questions her attachment to life itself. This is a woman, a young woman who's studying underground rivers. Of course, the biggest rivers on our planet are both above and also there are many under the ground. So invisible rivers shape our lives, atmospheric rivers, but also so many lost rivers. London is shaped by lost rivers, but so is New York, so is Moscow, Tokyo, Athens, beautiful Athens. You go to Athens, it feels like there are no rivers in the city, but actually there are, except they're under the ground. Or in France, we talk about Seine River, but we forget about Bivre. So it's interesting, as humanity, as civilizations progressed, what we did was to build our cities above rivers that we considered either insignificant or unnecessary or too filthy, too dirty, because of us, of course. And so we covered them. And I think right now, with climate crisis accelerating and with sea levels rising, that system is not going to be sustainable anymore. Those underground rivers cannot carry this much water. So we're going to see more and more flash floods. And because of this, today there's a counter movement in the world. Many people are now talking about bringing those rivers into daylight. And it's called daylighting. And there are very successful examples of this, especially in South Korea.
So for those who haven't read the book and will read the book, tell us a little bit about how these three completely seemingly unconnected individuals, all the devices you use to link them together, both in terms of little moments of coincidence and happenstance, but also in the narrative term. Like, why those three? How are they linked together? How are they interconnected? Because so much of the art of this book is telling distinct tales that are at once sort of like raindrops and clouds, sort of interwoven or interconnected.
Yes, and I think there's this beautiful essay by Umberto Eco in which he says, as a novelist, your job is not to invent connections. Your job is to see the connections, existing connections. So there are connections. We are all connected. Our stories, our destinies, our silences are connected. So I think literature likes to look into those silences, at least for me. Of course, as a storyteller, I love stories. I dedicate my life to stories. But I'm equally drawn to silences, to anyone who feels silenced. And I think literature has a way of paying more attention to the periphery, the margins, trying to bring the margins towards the center, hoping to make the invisible a bit more visible, yeah? And trying to rehumanize those who have been dehumanized. Organically, naturally, my heart goes in that direction. I started with these three characters, but as the story unfolds, you will see, I'm hoping that they are deeply, deeply connected. It doesn't matter whether it happened in the past or today. Earlier, we talked about underground rivers. I think it's an important metaphor. Just because we don't see those rivers, it doesn't mean they're not alive. Just because we don't see the past, it doesn't mean it's dead. I think the past continues to shape the present moment. We need to remember history. Memory is a responsibility, not in order to get stuck in the past. Of course not. But unless we understand the past, we keep making the same mistakes as humanity over and over. So there's a lot of emphasis in this book on the need for memory keeping. And if I may add this briefly, I think in every family there's at least one memory keeper. I'm always amazed by that, especially in immigrant families, how the elderly who have gone through the biggest hardships, they don't necessarily talk about the past, but it doesn't mean they have forgotten it. It just sits inside their chest. The second generation are not that interested in the past. Understandably, they need to build a new life, tabula rasa, but it's usually the third or the fourth generations, the youngest in these families, who are asking the biggest questions about ancestral heritage, what happened to their families, where are the family silences. So I digressed a little bit, but I think memory keeping is an important part of those connections.
There's also just an undeniable thread that runs through the narrative of poor parenting or parental abandonment or neglect. And that's, you keep encountering these instances of it. Why did you put that there?
Poor parenting. I think for each character it's slightly different. Like in the case of Narin, the Yazidi girl, she has a very strong connection with her grandmother. And I think grandma is the storyteller. If I may add this, it's very much echoing my own experience with my own grandmother. I was raised by a very spiritual, traditional grandmother until I was 10 years old. So her story is a little bit different. In the case of Arthur, there is poor parenting, but he's born into a very broken family structure. In the case of Zaleekhah, she has lost her parents, and there's a very controversial character, Uncle Malik, who is an immigrant and who is very much interested in material gain. So there are differences between Zaleekhah and Uncle Malik. I don't want to give too much about Uncle Malik. He holds secrets. So I think there are differences depending on each character, but I'm always interested in these generational differences in terms of how we deal with trauma, memory, and amnesia.
The relationship between, and you said it right at the top, between ecology, what we do with water, and violence and conflict and persecution. This seems to be a theme that it plays out in the Middle East today. Yeah. It's playing out not in the relation of persecution, but it's in North Carolina as we speak. Entire, communities utterly destroyed, once in 100-year floods. And the sense of water as both a giver of life and a source of nourishment and succor, but also this devastating force, and how that links to what human beings can do, both an enormous source of comfort, but also a source of violence and devastation. That water-human link is something that you play a lot with. I wonder if you can tell us more.
Yes, I think I wanted to, as I briefly mentioned, I wanted to say that we cannot take water for granted. We need to pay attention to it. But not only water, nature itself. The way we connect with nature or fail to connect, I think is so problematic. We have turned ourselves into consumers of nature. And the faster we consume, the more gratification we get in a faster way. We think the happier we will become. That's the definition, of our existence almost. And I find that quite problematic. We are not above nature. We're definitely not more clever than everything else. We're just a small part of a very delicate ecosystem. I am very interested in ecofeminism, the kind of feminism that tries to connect the dots. If you're interested, I don't think, to be honest, we can be single-issue people. We have entered an age in history in which we have to connect the dots. So if we care about social injustice, well, then we have to care about trees. If we care about, trees, then we have to care about class inequalities, widening inequalities, and so on. So everything is connected. But it's that ecofeminism helps me perhaps to approach this in a much more gentle way. Water is a big part of this story, but I'm also interested in how we fail to connect with the world around us.
I want to take a question, even a sort of step out of the book, and just ask you about your role in the world. You're very widely recognized. You're a sort of, that much abused phrase, kind of public intellectual person who leads a kind of a public life. You're also a woman from a particular part of the world that is really troubled right now and going through a very turbulent time. So tell us a little bit about, there's parts of that I sensed in this book.
Yeah.
Not explicitly always, but a sort of undertone from that. And I wonder if you sort of, that role as Elif, the public figure, and then Elif, the author, how that is playing out in your life right now.
Yeah, I think if you happen to be a storyteller from a wounded democracy, you don't have the luxury of being apolitical. You don't have the luxury of saying, I'm not going to talk about politics ever. I'm only going to talk about my poetry. I'm only going to talk about my fiction. As I mentioned, I am a feminist. One of the many things, wonderful things that I've learned from past generations of women's movement is that politics is not only about what Keir Starmer said today or what the Tories might have done yesterday. It's more than that. It's bigger than that. Wherever there's power imbalance, there's politics. You might be writing about sexuality. That's also quite political, right? So politics is much more diffuse in that sense. But I'm always intrigued by the negative connotation that the word public intellectual has in this country. I mean, in Turkey, we incarcerate our public intellectuals, but at least we recognize they're public intellectuals. In France, there's a very different tradition. In Russia, historically, there has been a different tradition and so on. But in the UK and US as well, there's the term intellectual is an almost negative thing. It's almost always associated with arrogance. Someone is trying to give themselves airs. For me, intellectual means, dedicating your life to books, ideas, learning, exchange of ideas. I wish, and I really genuinely believe we need to support more women public intellectuals. We need to support more public intellectuals from minority backgrounds. Their voices are not heard enough. And particularly, we need to support working class public intellectuals. So these are important for me. However, I don't like it. I really don't like it when a novelist tries to give answers. I don't know the answers myself, and I don't think that's a writer's job. I don't like the kind of books that try to teach something or preach something. That's not close to my heart at all. I think a novelist's job is only and only to ask questions and to create an open space in which a diversity of opinions can be heard, a plurality, a multiplicity that we are constantly denied in our daily lives. We're never allowed to celebrate our own multiplicity, right? Our own multitudes, as Walt Whitman used to say. But inside a novel, you can do that. And then I have to leave the answers to the reader, because every reader is going to come up with their own answers. So I've met couples who have been married for 45 years. They read the same book. They don't read it in the same way. I've met friends who share everything. One of them loves a novel, the other one not so much. Why? Because we all bring our gaze into the story. The reader is not passive. But I think a writer's job is to create that space of plurality. And if I may tie it to the Lamassu question you kindly asked me earlier, inside a novel, and that's one of the many reasons why I love literature so much, inside a novel you can hold nuanced conversations. I can be very critical of colonial institutional history and how those massive Lamassu sculptures, we're talking about sculptures that weigh between 20 and 40 tons, How did they end up in the British Museum? How did they end up in the Louvre, right? And what happened on the way? It wasn't a very smooth transition. We never talk about these things. So I can be quite critical of that. But at the same time, I can have appreciation for individual scholars like George Smith, who genuinely dedicated their life and love into this work. At the same time, I can talk about the destruction of cultural artifacts by ISIS fanatics. At the same time, I can question what was the Ottoman Empire doing in the meantime. So there are layers upon layers. The Middle East is incredibly complex. It was always very diverse. And I think it's such a pity that it's reduced to a few threads today. We always associate it with a few adjectives, but we're talking an incredibly rich land in history and culture.
So I want to come back to this sort of, I think you never get a sense in any of your work of the sense of finger wagging or didacticism or soapboxing. It's completely absent from your work, and you do indeed ask the provocative questions and then allow us the space to reflect and allow us to think about the subtleties and the nuance of difficult questions. So it was Climate Week in New York last week, and I was still clutching this book at that moment, and there was a session that we hosted on the relationship between impact and storytelling, and I thought how apposite that your book is there, and this is a book about hydrology and water and conflict and relationships, and one of the things that we sort of grappled with is that old saying that culture is upstream from politics, and that narrative and storytelling are the DNA of culture, and then you have politics. And we frame our politics so much through our culture, and it enables our politics. And yet, we live in a world where every moment the ravages of climate change are so apparent and so impacting, and water is one of the most destructive and obvious and palpable forms of that. And yet, as humans, we still seem to live in this world of denial and fable. And when we are literally slapped in the face or drowned or flooded out of our homes, we still invent different forms of narrative to justify our inaction or worse. And I wonder if your book sort of opened up the space for that conversation, but I wonder if you want to kind of, as a storyteller, tell us why we fail to hear the stories that enable our politics.
Really appreciate this question. Today and tomorrow, it is the celebration of Ukrainian storytelling. The global celebration in an act of solidarity with a culture under attack. And they asked us to read segments from Ukrainian literature. I read a poem by Ilya Kaminsky, the Ukrainian-American poet, which I think is so connected to what you said. The title of the poem is "We Lived Happily During the War." It is possible to live happily during someone else's war. And that is exactly how we treat also climate crisis, as someone else's crisis. And we continue to live happily until it comes and hits us. So we need to change that, and I think we need to question that. We need to dismantle that kind of numbness. I think in so many ways, actually, the age we're living in is the age of anxiety. There's an existential angst that affects all of us, East, West, every generation. The only difference is some people are better at hiding their anxieties than others. I think that's the only difference. And it's an age in which there's a lot of anger, understandably, frustration, confusion, fatigue, almost like an emotional fatigue, all of which, even though difficult, can be regarded as raw sources of energy if we can turn it into something more positive for ourselves, for our communities. There's only one emotion that really, really scares me, and that's the lack of all emotions, which is numbness, which is apathy, the moment we become desensitized. And I think that threshold is very dangerous when we say, well, what's happening in Afghanistan is sad, but none of my business. What's happening in Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza right now, today, Lebanon, it has nothing to do with me, you know, or climate crisis, because it is unfortunately disproportionately affecting right now the poorest nations, which contributed the least to climate crisis. So, you know, that's another inequality that we need to talk about. But it's possible to say none of my business for a while, and I think we need to change that. And art and literature are perhaps the best ways, because we can hold nuanced conversations, because we can feel each other's, you know, sorrows and joys, and realize that actually there's no us versus them. For a writer, there's no us and them. For a writer, I think the other is my brother. The other is my sister. I am the other. So it really dismantles those dualities. And I think, I wish more politicians would read more novels, more fiction. I'm always sad when some male readers of a certain age and background, they do this. They come with all the good intentions. They say, you know, so much is happening in the world. I don't have time for fiction. I read important things. You know, I read politics, I read finance, I read about technology. But then apologetically they say, but my wife reads fiction, you know. My girlfriend reads fiction. I feel sad when I hear this, because inside fiction there is politics, there is technology, there is climate, there is history, philosophy, but more importantly, there's emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single human being who does not need to connect with their emotions, especially in this age in which emotions are shaping and misshaping politics.
So I'm going to ask my final question. I'm going to hand over to what I'm sure is going to be a sort of an army of hands. I identify so strongly with what you said about the most dangerous emotion is the absence of all emotions. I mean, one of the reasons we set up the Conduit was to guard against inertia and indifference and numbness and fatalism, and that sense that every day there are things that you can do that restore hope in humanity and that can solve some of the world's most difficult problems step by step, not in a grandiose way, but step by step. So I'd like you to end with a note of optimism. Tell us what gives you joy, and tell us what should cause this audience to leave this conversation feeling buoyed and excited, notwithstanding both the inclement weather, metaphor connected, and the state of the world.
You ask me a difficult question, you know. I'm Turkish, and optimism doesn't come very easily to us. I think if you open a map of Europe and if you trace the river Danube, you know, with your finger, as you go towards the Black Sea, you cross, you pass by Romania, Bulgaria, the Black Sea, the level of optimism drops and drops and drops. So pessimism would be easier for me. That said, I really think it's okay for the mind to be a bit more pessimistic. Actually, it was a mistake, especially in late 1990s and early 2000s. There was so much optimism. And the biggest optimists back then were the tech optimists. They would tell us how Facebook was going to bring democracy to the world. Back then, a young family in Egypt, I remember they named their newborn baby Facebook with all, you know, because it meant hope. And I remember also a family in Israel, they named their third child Like. So think about those children, Facebook and Like, and look at the Middle East now. Fast forward, we have swung into the age of pessimism. I think it's okay for the mind to be a little bit more alert, as long as the heart can remain a bit more optimistic. And this is why this space that you've created is so important, Paul, because here we can slow down. This is not about snippets of information. Here we can hold nuanced conversations. We can disagree, agree, but learn from each other, listen. And I do find it very crucial to make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. We need to follow T.S. Eliot. He made those distinctions. Let's please deal with less information, because it doesn't help us at all. It just makes us arrogant. But more knowledge, and hopefully more wisdom. For wisdom, we need to bring the heart into the conversation. And so the optimism we need actually comes from our fellow human beings. When I hear your story, when I hear the story of women in Iran, for instance, the resilience of minorities in Turkey, you feel encouraged. You feel, you feel inspired. Just to finish, I think it's very important to make 3 connections in this age. One, with each other. Let's not become atomized individuals. All the philosophers warned us about this, especially Hannah Arendt. If we become atomized, it's a much more dangerous world. So let's connect. Let's connect beyond borders with each other. Secondly, let's connect with nature. You know, a tree, a river, just walk by the river. But nature, I think, teaches us a lot. And thirdly, let's connect with the inner garden. Whatever we're going to call that, a spiritual journey, some other name for it. But I think to connect with the inner garden and to keep that inner garden is also very important. So 3 crucial connections to hopefully give us a bit more optimism.
And I'm going to add a 2.5 between your facts, knowledge, and wisdom, information, knowledge, and wisdom. From knowledge, Tom Nagel, this wonderful philosopher, added the idea of acknowledgement. That knowledge is a state of affairs, but acknowledgement is to recognize the moral valence of a set of facts. So torture is happening, that's knowledge. Acknowledgement is that it's wrong. And once you have acknowledgement, it leads you to action. And I think that that little step is what's such an interesting thing. And I think your work and your books, they sit there like an ocean, and they stir things up and they're tidal. And then once you put it down, you feel prompted to act. And for that, I'm so grateful, and so grateful for your words. So, Elif Shafak.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have some time for some questions. So you in the front, please. And here comes a mic.
Thank you so much for such a rich and interesting conversation. I absolutely love your writing and always love hearing you speak, so it's such a joy. My question, I'm really excited to read this book. I haven't yet, but we'll definitely do so. It was really interesting that you wrote a book about water, and I think that's a very big theme for me that I think about. I'm a futurist, and I think that the wars of the future are going to be fought over water, something that I'm tracking and looking at the connections. What strikes me with it is that as a kind of society, and I'm talking in the kind of very broad sense, I think there are cultures and spaces in the world that really value water, but we don't adequately value it. We don't cost it in our economy. And I think, we build water parks in the desert. We use it in for farming and things that are kind of like water, irresponsible uses of water. And so you've talked about water scarcity. There isn't enough water, and it's the one thing as humanity that we need to survive. I'm curious from your exploration of kind of water in this book, why you think it is that we as kind of our society hasn't adequately valued water, and what it might take for us to adequately value it in the future for our collective future. Thank you.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful question. Thank you. I think our entire relationship with nature is so broken, and it's so self-centered, which is something which could have changed actually during COVID, and it seemed like there was a moment when it was going to change. Like we had started to appreciate more being able to sit under a tree and not take it for granted, and how fast we have even forgotten that moment in time, even though it's not that far away. So I think there's a lot of rethinking that we need to do. And there's one thing I want to add. We didn't get a chance to talk about this. When we were talking about Narin's story, for instance, in the book, she lives in a place in Turkey called Hasan Cave. The old name of this place is Castrum Kefa. We're talking about a 12,000-year-old settlement. Incredibly important because of its archaeological value, historical value, but also very important for biodiversity, for the ecosystem. Now, if you go to that place today, you will not find it because it's completely inundated, submerged, because the government built a very controversial dam there on that spot with the lifespan of 50 years, 50. So for 50 years, you know, you destroy 12,000 years old history, you hog water, you keep it to yourself, and the countries that are, you know, downstream, they're affected negatively. My point is, this is a global issue, and we cannot solve it with these isolationist, ultranationalist instincts. And again, that's one of the biggest ironies of our times, because as we're seeing an increase in these global challenges, we're also seeing an increase in isolationism, in ultranationalism and nativism. This is not only happening in Turkey, it's happening across the world. So again, everything is connected, and I think it's not implausible to say we might see water wars coming up in the future.
Over here.
Sorry, there's one on the side over there.
Oh, okay,
first.
fine. There's one over there, please. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks to you both for that beautifully enriching discourse. Really enjoyed that. Elif, is there anything that you wished you would have had this space or opportunity to include in the book with regards to any detailed thoughts or perspectives which you hadn't had a chance to?
Amazing question. I think there are things that I had to leave out. You know, writing a novel, I believe there are two different ways of writing a novel. One is a bit more like engineering, in which the author wants to be in charge and wants to know what each character is going to do in the next 6 chapters, if not wants to know the ending and everything. I respect that path, that method, but it's not my way. I like the second way, in which as an author you are a little bit drunk. You don't quite know what you're doing, you know? And you let the characters lead you. You let the storytelling. I feel like in my daily life, I'm just full of anxieties, panic attacks. I'm a very disorganized person. When I am writing, I change. And only because I feel like I tap into something bigger than me, older than me, wiser than me. And that's the ancient art of storytelling. Right? And that guides me. So in that regard, you know, there are things you want to include or not, but it's okay. You can let them out, leave them out. And so I don't think I've left anything out that hurts me right now. I just wanted to follow that flow. Thank you.
Something from this side over here. Is there a mic? Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much. It was very illuminating. Actually, I'm a writer myself, and one of the things that I've been struggling a bit with is, I guess when I'm thinking about, you know, the storytelling, and then I'm curious how you then integrate some of the things like you said you wanted to write about water, and then how did you get from the storytelling aspect to some of the more, I guess, political or historical aspects and bring those two things together? You know, without feeling like you're becoming either too expository or too, making it feel more like an essay than a novel.
Absolutely. I really appreciate this question. To me, this comes naturally because I've always been interested in interdisciplinary conversations. I stayed in academia for long years. I love learning. And I think the mind is always nourished better if we dare to leave our comfort zones and try to go beyond. It's much more interesting to me when a novelist starts studying music and the musician starts reading political philosophy and the political scientist becomes interested in poetry, for instance. You know, those are the conversations that intrigue me more. But to be honest, it is a big, big challenge. There are massive glass walls in the publishing industry, which affect us, especially those of us coming from the non-Western world. So if you happen to be, for instance, an Afghan woman writer, almost no one in the publishing industry expects you to write sci-fi or avant-garde or experimental fiction. You're expected to write about the problems of women in Afghanistan, which you may want to do, but maybe your next book is going to be about something else. There's not that kind of freedom is not given because we're instantly pigeonholed. I think women writers are expected to write about more domestic issues. When a male writer writes a novel of ideas, people say, amazing imagination. When a woman does that, I'll tell you the first adjective they will use is too ambitious. You know, it happens over and over. I love micro novels, but I also love novels of ideas. There is room inside literature for all this diversity, but we should not be pigeonholed. I also think, I'm assuming you're not Turkish, you can write about a Turkish character if you genuinely feel connected. One of the most wonderful female characters in literature were written by male novelists, right? Tolstoy wrote Anna Karenina, Flaubert wrote Emma Bovary. So we can make those journeys if we feel a genuine connection, if we do our work well. We have to do a lot of research, but it's not only about research. I think we have to do a lot of listening, some unlearning on our part, but then let the heart be our guide. And I think that's where it stops being an intellectual, cerebral work. It becomes an emotional journey. So I try to make the heart my guide. But for me to be able to feel that kind of confidence, I try to read and learn as much as I can about every single detail. And then there comes a moment when you can take off, when you can fly. From that moment onwards, it's not about the intellect, it's only about the heart.
Somewhere in the back, all the way, and I will come to you, I promise. You're so enthusiastic, I can't leave you hanging.
Thank you so much. I have another question about writing. I'm Chinese, and I also write in both Chinese and English. And I know you also write in both Turkish and English. So I'm just curious, and especially talking about connecting to heart, which language do you feel is more connected to your heart? And when you write, how do you decide when to write in English and in Turkish?
What a beautiful question. I'm always interested in how we express different emotions in different languages. I have Italian friends who, when they're a little bit angry, they immediately switch back to Italian, you know? It's so interesting. My children say I do something similar. You know, I switch immediately back to Turkish when I want them to take my words more seriously. So it's interesting. And of course, as a writer, our mother tongues, we have the biggest emotional connection with our mother tongues, don't we? And it would have been much easier for me to write in Turkish, to be honest. As you can hear in my accent, I am not a native speaker. I did not grow up speaking English. This for me is an acquired language. I'm an immigrant in this language, not only in this country, but also in this language, which means, like every immigrant, I experience this gap between the mind and the tongue. The mind always runs faster. The tongue is always trying to catch up, but failing to do so. So you're always more aware of the things you fail to say, the jokes that you can't quite crack, right? Nevertheless, despite all the challenges, I have completely switched to writing in English about 20 years ago, even though I wrote my earlier novels in Turkish first. And the reason is because being a writer in Turkey, a novelist in particular, is so heavy. And being a woman writer is even heavier. Whatever you write, from history to sexuality, you offend the authorities, you offend some groups in the civil society. You can be put on trial, prosecuted, investigated. I've gone through those things so many times. And there came a moment when I felt the need for a bit more cognitive distance, a little bit more lightness. Writing in English gave me that sense of lightness, despite the challenges, despite the difficulty. It's a bit like you take a step back if you want to see a painting better. You don't always go forward, you go back, right? And it gave me that distance. Maybe writing in English enabled me to take a closer look at the country where I come from, the culture where I come from. But that said, I still find melancholy, sorrow, longing. These things are much, much easier to express in Turkish. But when it comes to humor, which I love, humor is our oxygen, I find humor, irony, and satire much easier to express in English.
Actually, this lady over here.
Finally, my moment. Hi, Elif.
Hi.
My name is Shirin. I'm a psychotherapist specialized in PTSD. So I've been working with victims of war and torture since 2000. I do come across many who are very grateful to you because you voiced them. And I wished for this moment to be here. And this is why I'm so enthusiastic to hold on to the microphone and thank you, because I can see that they learn from you, and I can see that they are comforted by your words. And thank you for that. My question. I do have a question for you. Within the Maso movement, I know that you know about the movement in Iran, inside Iran. There were many who were reading your books and they were paying their gratitudes. Anyway, within that movement, I volunteered within the organizations that could reach out to people inside Iran whom I could work with. And I had difficulty keeping the boundaries and balance my own life and my own work, and then volunteering extra hours. And there were points in my life that I felt that I wasn't enough. I didn't have enough hours, I wasn't enough to reach out, I wasn't enough to help. How do you balance that?
First of all, thank you so much for your words. I'm very, very grateful. It's such a thoughtful question. And it's also a question that I keep asking myself. You know, it's not something that I've solved and left behind. But that's precisely why I don't call myself an activist. Out of respect for people who dedicate their energy, their time to activism, I only call myself a storyteller, you know, that's it. I'm an introvert, like many novelists are, but it's an endless mystery to the introvert in me how much I enjoy these encounters. When we get together, when we hear each other's, what you shared with me right now is so important. And it's going to maybe inspire me tomorrow. Maybe something I said will inspire someone else tomorrow. So we have to get together. These spaces, these cultural spaces, literary spaces are incredibly, incredibly precious. I think we're all struggling. Some days we find it difficult even to muster the energy. It feels like I don't have any energy to give to other people. But then what someone else says when you read books, you know, a sentence that you catch, it emboldens us, it encourages us. No one said it better than James Baldwin. I'm not doing justice to his beautiful essay, but he says, you think your pain is unique, your suffering is happening only to you, but then you read. And then when you read, you realize you're not alone. So we have to dismantle that feeling of loneliness. That's the worst thing. You know, the atomized individuals we cannot be. And that's why I think we need literature, just like we need air and the water that we've been speaking about.
I'm just going to bring in a question from online, from Daniela, who asks, Elif, how has your approach to writing changed over the years? How did the topics come to you, and did your author's inner voice become more critical or explorative?
Wonderful question. I still am not sure whether we choose the subjects we write about or the subjects come and find us. It's not a very rational process, but what I try to do is I keep my curiosity alive. Let's read, you know, anything and everything that speaks to us in that moment in time, from cookbooks to graphic novels, to political philosophy. There's no such thing as highbrow literature, lowbrow literature. Who makes those distinctions? Just let's keep reading, you know, eclectic reading lists. Also, I think as writers, we need to be good listeners. I try to listen to what people say, not only what they're saying, but how they're saying, with what kind of energy. Again, maybe it's an experience that I acquired with my grandmother. There were so many things she wouldn't be able to say. Instead, she would feed you, you know. This was a woman who had experienced so many hardships in her life, and she didn't know how to talk about them. So I realized that food is a language for women like my grandmother, especially her generation. So let's pay attention to details in life. I think for those of us who want to focus on untold stories, written culture is not enough. Most of the history that is taught to us in Turkey is his story, by which I mean the story of a few men in positions of power and privilege, like sultans, Sheikhul Islams. But the moment you start asking, what was the Ottoman Empire like for an Armenian silversmith, for a Jewish miller, for an Arab peasant, for a Kurdish farmer, for a Greek sailor, there's a big silence. What was the empire like for women? big silence, right? So in order to find those silences that written culture has conveniently forgotten, I think we need to turn our attention to oral culture, oral storytelling, micro-histories. And in that sense, maybe writers need to be a bit like archaeologists, like linguistic, cultural archaeologists. We need to go underneath those layers. All I'm trying to say is if we keep that curiosity alive, there are ideas everywhere. Stories are everywhere. We're never short of stories. And then the rest is discipline. We just have to sit down and write. And please don't worry about what other people will say, how we will be judged. I just want to add this very briefly. I used to go to schools in Turkey and in the Middle East. When you speak to a 6 or 7-year-old Jordanian, Turkish, or Syrian child, those kids are no different than a French child or a Norwegian or a Canadian child. And children at that age have so much chutzpah. Just yesterday, I was at Henley, and the 7-year-old came and he said, "I'm also a writer." I said, "It's so nice to meet you." He said, "I've written 2 books. I'm now working on my 3rd book." It's incredible, that chutzpah, that confidence, but a 15-year-old would not talk like that. 16-year-old would never speak like that. Why? Because through those years at school, in the neighborhood, through society, we teach our children to lose their confidence. Especially to girls, we say, you know, you will be judged how you sit, the length of your skirt, what you write about, if there's sexuality in it. So little by little, we become timid. And I think we have to remember what we had as children naturally and just rebuild that inner garden. So that's where stories come from.
So we have come to the end of an evening. I listened very carefully when you were saying that a writer who writes in a second language, their mind races ahead and they're always failing to find the words. And I have one reaction, which is keep failing. Because this is what failure looks like, then we have a lot to learn. So I know you're going to be signing books at the back. There are a number of books which will go like wildfire. If they sell out, there are more that Stanford's can provide. They're nodding in the back. Support the publishing industry and support remarkable authors. And Elif Shafak, thank you so much again.
I'm so grateful. Thank you so much.